It's not gone away. He does such a good job at this, much better than I am, but I'm going to fill in for Brooks tonight. We always start with the Pledge of Allegiance, so if you can stand. I pledge
allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you, everybody. I'm going to go through my notes here, but a couple of things off the top of my head. We have our 2025 sponsors finally printed on our poster board. It's actually up front. There's two signs that are made. One travel, so it's for road games, and one's for home games. The home game will be placed here finally and replacing the sponsors from last year. But please take a look at those and thank our sponsors that help us do the things that we do here at the museum. Speaking of the museum, our museum director, Brooke Kerwin, has finished her term at the end of June. She's going to be moving on to grad school. And Tyler Yacht, who I don't think was able to come tonight, he was sick earlier. So we're going to honor Brooke at the Yacht Rock party in August. So if you haven't purchased your Yacht Rock tickets at the new Freeman Sasser building, please do that. Yeah, let's see, Cheryl's got a hat, she's ready to go. I'd like to remind everybody, even if you're not into Yacht Rock or not even sure what is Yacht Rock, a couple of things. One is it's at the newly renovated Freeman Sasser building. So if no other reason, come out and see the new renovation of the building at the Senoia City Park. Please come to do that. But the biggest reason is to support this organization. We only have 4 fundraisers per year. We badly need ticket sales. As of this morning, we had only sold 19, and we're expecting 200 ticket sales. So if you're planning on going and you haven't purchased your tickets, please do so. If you haven't thought about it, please do so. If you can't make it, or you're not into rock or whatever, and you can still support the Historical Society by purchasing those tickets, please do so. We do need this fundraiser to help Mr. Bill make our budget for the year. But Tyler will take over as museum director from July 1st, so obviously that's from now. A lot of neat programs are already scheduled. Jennifer's done a good job with these Thursday programs, but there's been 3 kids' days at the museum. The second one's coming up this Sunday. As most of you know, we've changed our museum hours for the summer from from Friday, Saturday to Saturday, Sunday, 1 to 4. So I know those of you that are volunteering know that. If you've got friends and family coming in from out of town, the museum's a great place to come and spend a couple hours and see the neat artifacts that are in the building. So anyway, please support us with the Yacht Rock tickets and Tyler in his new position. I'm also pointing to the easel here, the Hilton Head raffle. We've sold 20 of those tickets. For $50, you get a chance to win a week's vacation at Hilton Head, compliments of Dennis and Martha Sanford. We've done that for a few years now. We plan to sell 75 tickets, I think, so your chances of winning are 1 in 75. Currently, we've sold 20 tickets, so my chance of winning is 1 in 20. So if you would like part of that, if you hadn't been to Hilton Head in a while, obviously it's a destination, but the restaurants there are awesome, and Dennis and Martha's place is very, very nice, so you can purchase that online. Other announcements, our Facebook live recording that Jeremy's doing tonight, those are posted on the website. So if you happen to miss a program or you want to go back and listen to something else again, you can go on the website for past events. And Jeremy's got a link there to our YouTube channel. And you can see all the past lectures that are now neatly tucked in the website. So thank you, Jeremy, for putting that together. I mentioned Kids Day at the museum is Sunday. Tammy couldn't make it tonight, but she wanted me to make sure that everybody was aware of that. It's been a big, big success both last year and this year, bringing in a younger crowd for the museum, and it's been good community outreach. Also, I'd like to remind everybody the auction has been set for November 8th. So mark your calendars for the auction. That's our largest fundraiser of the year. And so we will begin collecting items for the silent auction and auction, if we haven't already, making way for that. And one other point of business, in October we'll have our business meeting, which will elect new officers. If you have an interest in serving on the 2026 board, please let me know. I will be rolling off this year, as will Tom Jackson in the back, and Tammy. So we've got 3 positions that we do need to fill. Jan asked me to announce, if you are at the museum and notice the water faucet on the front by the cold box is on, to leave it on. I made a mistake of turning it off, and that, I guess there's automatic watering set up for the flowers there. So guilty as charged. If you happen to be at the museum, sorry Jack, if you happen to be at the museum and you do notice the water on, then please leave that on. But at any rate, museum, Jan and her team, Letty, have done a great job of landscaping, particularly on this side. I did have another plumber come out today to quote for water on that side, so hopefully we'll be addressing that soon. But thank you for what you do for there. Speaking of Letty and Brooke had approached the board and they want to redo the meeting room decorations here. So we kind of put this up as a hodgepodge after the meeting room got built, and they now have a plan. So we've approved money to frame 10 historic homes. So historic homes will be neatly matched around the building there. So that's a good look for us. Okay. I'd like to introduce Jennifer, who will introduce our speaker, but thank you all for coming.
Get it on
I got you.
I know, I'm stuck. All right, thank you.
Are you going to walk?
Yeah, I think William would like to walk with it, correct? So,
I can grab it.
okay.
This way.
Okay. Thank you. It's my pleasure to introduce our guest speaker tonight. This is William Rawlings. He is a native of Sandersville, Georgia, and is a physician by trade, and in his spare time he is a novelist, and he has written several unique stories about Georgia, some of them true and some of them about historic crimes, which is kind of interesting. So he has his books here as well, but tonight he's going to speak about one of our earliest scandals in Georgia, and some of you have probably heard about the land grabs of early Georgia and the Yazoo Fraud scandal, and he knows so much more about it than I do. So without further ado, thank you, William, for coming tonight.
Thank you so much. It's an honor to be here. I think I'm going to put this up here if I can. And we'll do it like that. And can everybody hear me all right here? Good. Let me get my notes here and we'll get going. Tonight, we're going to talk about 2 very interesting bits of Georgia history that you may or may not know about. How many of you went to school, specifically the 8th grade in Georgia? Okay, we got a good group. Well, if you remember, somewhere in that horrible required Georgia history section that you had to take, there was one paragraph that had to do with the Great Yazoo Fraud. And the only reason I remember it was because the name was so peculiar. You know, it's just kind of weird. So I remembered it. And then later, as I got more interested in things in my adult life, I realized it was absolutely fascinating. And there's another scandal that happened just after that called the Pine Barrens Speculation, which I'll go over with you. You don't read as much about that or hear as much about that. And I couldn't figure out why, because, gosh, it's even worse and much more interesting. And the reason was it's horribly complicated. And so I'm going to try to explain to you tonight. So that's what we're going to talk about, first of all. This first about the Great Yazoo Fraud. And by the way, this is a PowerPoint presentation, and one of the first rules of PowerPoint is that you don't put too much garbage on the screen because people can't read it. But this is so complicated, and since this group is usually adults, I'll use that word kindly since I'm one myself. I wrote out everything I'm saying more or less so you can follow along with me and perhaps carry the story to the end. The Great Yazoo Fraud was something that took place in the latter, after the American Revolution, but before the year 1800. This is a map, theoretically. I bought this in London years ago. It's dated 1806, but this is probably a map of Georgia that would have been prior to 1802. And if you're familiar with things here, let's see if this works. It doesn't work there. If you're familiar with things, Georgia at that time was the largest state in the Union. It stretched from the coast, which is now the Georgia coast, all the way to the Mississippi River. The northern border was basically the same as it is today with Tennessee, and to the south, it was cut off by two Spanish possessions. One was West Florida and one was East Florida. Those didn't become part of the United States till about, they were purchased in 1819 by the government. At the end of the Revolutionary War, this was the approximate settlement area of Georgia. Georgia was settled up the river and then a little bit out. So first you had the Savannah River. Next you have the Ogeechee River. Then you have the Oconee River. Then you have the Mulgee River in Georgia when you go from east to west. My family's lived in Washington County since about 1800s, late 1790s. So we've been there a long time. And you end up knowing a lot of things and knowing a lot of people. We had a little farm down on the Ogeechee River, which is interesting because it was an Indian trading post at one time. It was sort of the end of civilization. And it was, when I was a child, we'd go down there and look to find Indian artifacts, pottery and all kinds of fascinating stuff. Now, this was where Georgia was settled, but over here to the extreme west, this was owned by the Spanish in the south, and they had claims that went further north, which were ill-defined. And it was also claimed, rightfully so, by the Native American tribes. So you had two other entities, I guess I can use that word, that Spain and the several Native American tribes that said, this is our land, and while you may lay claim to it, you ain't got it, The population distribution was very important because even though Georgia was the largest state in the Union, it was the smallest in population in the year 1791. You can see that Virginia had 747,000 people, Pennsylvania 434,000, New York 41,000. And here in Georgia, we had only 82,500, a minuscule number compared to the other states. And of this, 35% of the population were slaves. So the free population was only 53,000 people. Again, compared to Virginia, 747,000. We were sparsely populated and we had more land than anybody else. The Georgia legislature, there was pressure to give up claims to Western lands. For example, North Carolina had claims, Virginia had claims, and the United States said, the central government in the United States said, well, you really don't need this, so why don't you give it up to us and we can make another state out of it and so forth and so on. Well, Georgia didn't want to do that. So they created a thing over here at Bourbon County, which was at the base of the Yazoo River, right on the Mississippi, and they said, well, this is kind of cements our claim to this, and we'll just get around to settling it when we have a chance. But there were problems. The lands were claimed by by Spain and Indian tribes, and if you are familiar with the Constitution, these were negotiations with foreign entities, both of them. So that was in conflict with the Constitution at that time. Georgia's claim to be able to negotiate with Spain and Indian tribes apparently was in conflict with national sovereignty. And as I said a moment ago, most of the other states had given their claims to Western lands. And finally, Georgia in 1788 tried to sell the Bourbon County to the U.S. government because it was terribly expensive. They had spent $171,428. I don't know what that is in $25, but I think it would be in the billions at this point. In exchange for recognition of the state's rights, they wanted to sell this to the U.S. government. This figure here was the exact amount they had spent defending Bourbon County from hostile Indian tribes, is what I have read. And there were more motivating factors about what needed to be done. As far as the state of Georgia, we needed citizens. We needed them to raise taxes. We needed them to raise a militia. We needed political power in the new nation because, as you know, the House of Representatives is based on population. And we also needed citizens there who called themselves Georgia citizens to affirm the claims to these disputed territories. On the other hand, the people were different. Individual settlers, they said, listen, we need land for settlement to build a better life. We need land as a personal asset because in those days, that was the number one asset for most individuals, most families, with the land they owned. And also, the land was considered a commodity in those days. That is, if you could buy it, you could hold on to it. And if you didn't use it, didn't sell it, there was somebody who would want it because this country was expanding, particularly in the South. This was the main thing. And this potential demand for new virgin lands attracted speculators, most of whom were from the North. This was not Georgians. And these speculators, who later, I'll tell you about that in a moment, looked at the state of Georgia and said, gee, you know, you have a small little group of settlements here that's kind of close to the Atlantic coast. And, you know, we're talking about stuff halfway across the continent, you know, over in what is now Mississippi and Alabama. So you guys really don't need it. You know, we'd like to buy some of it, you know. So they got together in 1789. There were 3 land companies formed, and they offered to buy 15.5 million acres in what is now Alabama and Mississippi. And they offered $207,580, which won't buy you a small 2-bedroom home these days. But that was apparently a lot of money at the time. But there was a problem there because it was unsurveyed, and the actual acreage turned out to be 25.4 million. So put the cost of this, they were bidding basically 1.34 cents per acre. Okay. So there was a bargain. And the deal was even better. If I could pull this off, I'd be in the land business right now. The deal was no money down, and the payment was due in 2 years, but that gave them adequate time for the speculators to have bought the land and sold it to other people. They would have made a profit, given it back, and everything would have been fine. But, you know, that's not very good. The land companies were all composed of out-of-state speculators, and some of these were quite prominent individuals. Patrick Henry, for example, was one of the ones that was a member of one of the groups that wanted to buy land. So a group of Georgia citizens, seeing that the lands were going to out-of-staters, they formed a 4th company besides the first 3, and they said, we will give you more money if you will sell the land to us. Same deal, we'll pay you more for that, of course. And the legislature, ignoring the new offer, sold the land to the first group in just 9 days after receiving their offer. And I don't think they had ways to, nobody could look up their email at the time, but I think these people were paid off, you know. At least that's what I think. And everybody ended up being very upset about it. So the legislature said, we've got to do something about this. Let's make a change. So they said, let's require the speculators to pay in hard currency instead of paper notes. And of course they couldn't. And of course the deals fell through. And this was the first go around of the Great Yazoo Fraud. It was, you know, kind of like you're walking across the street and this car comes and almost hits you, but you avoid it. It was that kind of thing. You know? They got by. But pardon? Yeah, but they had to pay in hard currency when they paid, and they were all floated notes at the time. Hard currency specie was mainly Spanish dollars. You know, well, that's why a quarter is called 2 bits. You know, the Spanish real. The reals were quote unquote Spanish dollars. There was ocho reales was a typical size, and 1/4 of that cut in quarters would be 2 bits, 4 bits, 6 bits a dollar. It's a very old thing. 2 bits is a quarter that comes from the Spanish real. So the speculators has nothing to do with this. Just wanted to say it. The group of speculators said, this is too big to pass up. We got to think of something better. And so in 1794, several years later, they formed 4 new companies to buy Georgia's western lands. And this time the offer was $500,000 for 21.75 million acres, which unsurveyed, I should say, which turned out to be closer to 35 million acres. This time they raised the price from 1.3 to 1.4 cents per acre. And the deal was, in order to get around the problem that cropped up the first time, they said, we'll pay 20% down in cash and the remainder in approved currency with 1 year. Because by this time, there was a huge pressure on settlers of all varieties heading south, and these massive, unsettled, rich lands to the western part of the Georgia were very attractive. People wanted them. They would pay 20% down in improved currency, but then importantly, the state of Georgia was to guarantee the titles to the land. So in case something screwed up or something fell through, the buyer had already bought the land, and guess who the burden to ensure the title would fall on? It would fall on the state. Okay. And once again, Georgia citizens, they formed a fifth company and offered $300,000 more than the other four companies combined, plus other inducements. And by other inducements, that means there were lands set aside for poor people and so forth and so on. So it was a much better offer, although it was an offer that they would have been foolish to accept, I think. And the new offer was rejected. Why? Within a matter of weeks, the legislature passed the bill and sent it to the governor for his signature. And the governor vetoed it. So a committee was formed to overcome his objections. That means the governor hadn't been bribed and he needed some money, I think, is probably what happened, although that's not documented that I can find. So they passed it by tacking it on to another bill in the legislature. And I'll read you the name of this bill, which is an act supplementary to an act for appropriating a part of the unallocated territory of this state for the payment of the late state troops and for other purposes therein mentioned, declaring the right to the unappropriated territory thereof for the protection and support of the frontiers of the state and for other purposes mentioned therein. I mean, nobody knows what that means. I know it. And it passed and was signed by George Matthews in early 1795. So they'd sold the land. This was the Yazoo Fraud. But this is what the land looked like. This is there are four companies, I said. To the upper, near the Tennessee border, you have the upper Mississippi Company, the Tennessee Company. These two are at the top around the Tennessee River and Muscle Shoals. Further south, you have the Georgia Company here, butts up to the Mississippi here, and the Alabama River in the south. You have the Georgia Mississippi Company here. And this was this is what the land was. This was part of the state, basically the entire state of Mississippi, and some of Alabama was sold. But there was a huge public reaction to this. There are not many newspapers. There were not many newspapers in the era, but what I could find in researching this revealed there was a lot of discord because everyone felt that they had been totally screwed by if I use the term, by the legislature. So a new legislature was voted in, and their investigation revealed that 28 of the 29 legislators who had voted for the Yazoo Act had received bribes. Most of the time, this was bribes in the form of land. And Jared Irwin in 1795 was elected governor. He took office the following January of 1796, and he said, "Listen, we've got to do something about this. We can't have this thing going through." So they passed the Rescinding Act within a month of the time he assumed the governorship. Irwin did. It directed that the records of the Yazoo Act, quote, be expunged from the faces and indices of the books of record of the state, and that enrolled law or usurped act shall then be publicly burnt in order that no trace of so unconstitutional, vile, and fraudulent a transaction other than the infamy attacked to this by this law shall remain in the public offices thereof. It was. How many of you know the Georgia plates? Are any of you familiar with Georgia plates? They're made by that's the official plate of the state of Georgia. You are good, thank you. You have the Great Yazoo Fraud. There is on the Georgia plates, which are made by Wedgwood and sold by the Woman's Club in Sandersville. This is an engraving of burning the Yazoo Fraud papers. And this was in front of the State House. The state capital at the time was in Louisville. You remember it was Augusta and subsequently Louisville and subsequently Milledgeville as it moved west. And you see this guy right here, he has a magnifying glass in his hand. And the deal was that this act was so vile and reprehensible it would be burned by fire from heaven. And supposedly they lit it with a magnifying glass. And I this I did a lot of reading when I was writing this up, and everyone said, oh, that's an apocryphal tale, they didn't really do it like that. And so I got to dig it, and the Augusta Chronicle's been around a long time, and the Augusta Chronicle actually documented that they had used a magnifying glass to set fire to this law and burn it in public. So that's fine. Okay, so that was that. Well, almost. If you go to Louisville now, which is a great place, there's a marker on the front of the Jefferson County Courthouse, which sits where the State House sat at the time. And if you go to Sandersville, which is only 25 miles away and really the center of the universe, you should come and visit. There's a monument to Jared Irwin. He was from Washington County. Now, let me qualify that by saying Washington County was one of the first two counties in the state. It stretched from basically north of Athens down to Liberty County and the coast. It was a huge county. The Franklin County and Washington County were the first two counties in the state of Georgia. There were numerous other counties that were eventually made from Washington County, but it was big. In 1855, downtown Sandersville was burned in an accidental fire, like a lot of small towns. Everything basically burned down. So the city fathers laid out a wonderful city square, which is still in use. And in 1856, the legislature of Georgia gave this as a monument to put on the square, and it's to honor Washington County's more famous citizen, Jared Irwin. And you can't read this from where you are, but it talks about signing the rescinding an act rescinding the Yazoo law. It's a very interesting monument. It's been there since 1856, and if you were there now, the courthouse would be over here, and my private office is that away. So stand by the monument and wave at me. I'm upstairs. So the consequences, well, the first thing, a bill was swiftly passed in the Georgia legislature requiring that all bills accurately state their content, and this has been true since 1796. And in fact, most states now have this. Any of you legislators in here? Can I say anything? Legislators sometimes have a way of doing things, and apparently the original Yazoo law, that Yazoo bill, was not accurate. So now the bills say what's in the titles say what's in the bill. And Georgia was forced to begin negotiations with the federal government to end the legal mess because, if you remember, they agreed to guarantee the titles. Okay, and there were a lot of problems with this. In the end, the state gave up its lands to the west of the Chattahoochee in part for the national government's agreement to assume the legal liabilities. This was in 1802. And there were a lot of interesting things that happened. The speculators that had bought the land and quickly sold it, and Georgia, despite having passed the Rescinding Act, had guaranteed the titles. Georgia had disavowed the titles despite passing with the Rescinding Act. And in 1810, there was a landmark suit called Fletcher versus Peck. And in 1810, regarding some of the land sold under the Great Yazoo Fraud, this was the first law that the U.S. government, the U.S. Supreme Court, had declared unconstitutional because it was a contract. And as you know, Article 1 of the Constitution is called the Contract Clause, and this violated the Constitution. Therefore, the Rescinding Act was declared unconstitutional. But the state of Georgia had already turned the state's obligations over to the U.S. government, and they covered it. And in 1814, Congress passed the first bailout bill appropriating $5 million to pay for claims related to the Yazoo Act. So it was the first bailout. Two things important. And the other thing, and it was the last of many lawsuits about this were settled in 1864. So this lasted nearly 80 years, almost 70 years. Now, the other thing about this thing was the 11th Amendment of the Constitution. If you remember this is the first 10 amendments of the Bill of Rights. 11th Amendment was that it's a citizen can't sue a state without the state's permission. Those of you that are attorneys in here, you can correct me. But the Great Yazoo Fraud led to the 11th Amendment of the Constitution indirectly. Whenever you read about this 11th Amendment, the case of Fletcher versus Peck is always mentioned as one of the precipitating things that produced this. So. Now, the Pine Barrens speculation was a totally different thing. It actually had the same purpose at heart, that is, let's make money. But it was in the 1790s, and this was not in my 8th grade Georgia history book. I didn't know about it. And I got to thinking, it's pretty interesting. I wonder why no one's really written much about it. And then I got to digging and decided it's so complicated that, you can barely figure it out. It's difficult to write about. If you think the Yazoo fraud was complicated, it wasn't. This was indeed complicated. This is called the Pine Barrens speculation. And by Pine Barrens, you mean areas that don't have anything but basically pine trees going. Much of South Georgia below the fall line, and the fall line, if you're not familiar with it, is a geologic marker of the former seacoast. It stretches basically from Columbus to Macon. From Columbus to Macon to Augusta. Above the fall line in the Piedmont, we have rolling hills, and then you get to the mountains, Appalachian Mountains, and primarily in the northwestern part of the state. Below the fall line is a coastal plain. It's sandy land. It's not particularly good for agriculture. It grows longleaf pine very well, but longleaf pine is, what we grow now for timber is loblolly pine mostly, and that has a timber cycle of about 30 years, and longleaf pine has a timber cycle close to 100 years. So it was not very good land, but people didn't know that when they were speculating. If the Great Yazoo Fraud represented corruption and malfeasance on a state and national level, its evil twin, the Pine Barrens speculation, was representative of the same on a local and regional level, aided and abetted by state officials. At the end of the American Revolution in 1783, 95% of the land that comprises modern Georgia, that's to the Chattahoochee, was held in the public domain. And the public domain basically means the state belongs to the land belongs to the state of Georgia, to the public of the state of Georgia. And this was land that was eligible to be sold or given away by the state, usually given away to attract settlers. Dispensing of public lands became one of the main concerns of the new state government for the same reasons I showed you before. You wanted population, you wanted tax revenue, you wanted people to help form a militia, you wanted population so you would be better represented in Congress. And among the first acts of the Georgia Assembly, a series of land courts were established to give away public land based on the head right system. And this policy was in effect until the Land Lottery Act of 1803. So for a period of time here, land was given away by head right. If you look at the map of Georgia, prior to 1803, these lands here, before, remember, the Yazoo fraud involved basically western part of the state, but this is the I think this is the Ocmulgee River here. No, this is the Oconee River here. I'm sorry, that's the Ocmulgee, and that's the Savannah River. So these were areas that were where not otherwise claimed belonged to the state, and they could be given away if you got a land grant. After that, the rest of the state was given away by lottery. Okay. Grants were given based on household size: 200 acres for the head of a household, 50 acres for each family member, and 50 acres for each slave up to 8 slaves. So the maximum for any one family was 1,000 acres. And there were exceptions. If you'd served in the Revolutionary War and in the military, you could get a bonus for that, and I presume other things as well. So you could get more than that, but generally speaking, 1,000 acres was probably more in those days than any family could reasonably farm, but that's how much they could own. These rules were loosely interpreted by the local land courts. So the land courts were kind of it wasn't the legislature, or there was no constabulary that took care of this. This was just local guys kind of going down. It was like your building inspector getting bribed or something like that. It was that kind of thing. And to get a land grant, you would appear in front of the land court. you would swear your eligibility. That is, perhaps you were a veteran, perhaps you had a wife and you had 3 slaves or something like that, and you would qualify for X number of acres. You would have found a piece of land. You would say what you wanted. If the court approved it, and apparently they commonly did, a warrant would be issued, and the county surveyor would survey this. And then that would be sent to the Secretary of State, and who would have the governor examine it and sign the grant, certifying the title in the name of the grantee. And let me tell you, these were not examined. These 2 articles are based on this presentation is based on 2 articles in a book I wrote, and the Governor Matthews was just examining thousands of. It's kind of like Joe Biden in the article, and he was examining thousands of potential grants a day and signing them. At least he said he was. This is a land grant signed by Governor Matthews from 1794. This apparently belonged to a member of my family. As I was saying earlier, we moved to Washington County about 1790, the late 1790s, around 1800, between 1798 and 1800. And apparently we had some land grants. When my grandmother died, I was left with a trove of family documents, most of which I didn't understand. This one is interesting. I could not find out where it is, but I know it was signed by Governor Matthews here. It's got a seal, the state of Georgia seal, and this was a plat apparently prepared for the prepared and signed by the surveyor. This was the form that was filled out by the surveyor, and if the governor approved, he would put a signature on it, and you would own the land. But there were problems. There was no restriction on buying, selling, or trading warrants. And if you were qualified, you could show up and say, I want 1,000 acres and get it, and you could turn around and sell it. And I guess if you go to the next town and say, I want 1,000 acres, and if you want it, you could get it. And people were certainly abusing this system. The land courts often ignored the 1,000-acre rule. They would sometimes give away more than that. And in 1787, for example, a number of individuals received grants of up to 50,000 acres each, if you can imagine that. And the governor issued an order limiting the grants to 1,000 acres, so the courts would have the surveyor plat out multiple contiguous 1,000-acre grants. So by 1793 and 1794, there was evident corruption at every level. For example, 3 county surveyors received $1.4 million, $1.22 million, and 227,000 acres respectively, which they surveyed for themselves or for each other. One of the surveyors surveyed, quote unquote, 52,000 acres in one day, another did 100,000 acres in one day, and a third did 118,000 a few days later. One of the gross offenders, I don't know, anybody know what the town of Tennell? That's kind of a subdivision of Sandersville. Anybody ever heard of Tennell? Tennell is down the road. It's 3 miles from Sandersville. We live in a small town, like y'all, and people that are only 3 miles away, they're a little different from us. They're not quite as sophisticated as we are. Francis, it was named for Francis Tennell, who was one of the surveyors, who apparently got a lot of land. To speed up the process, the grants were pre-printed before they were even completed. Okay, and dozens of individuals received grants ranging from 10,000 to 500,000 acres. Can you imagine that? 640 acres in a square mile. A lot of land. And surveyors resorted to what's called shingling. They were laying the plats on one on top of the other, and they would create land that didn't exist. You had plants like this. Okay. Have y'all ever heard of this Pine Barrens Speculation? This is the first time. It's fascinating. And the plats were enhanced to show streams and hardwood forests where none existed. So, you could take this up north to somebody who lived in New York and say, listen, this has got solid walnut forest here. There's a big creek that runs through it. It wasn't. It was pine barrens. You were lucky to get anything but pine trees to grow. The vast majority of these land grants were sold to speculators who intended to resell them for a profit. And this is fascinating here. One of the larger purchasers was Robert Morris, Jr., at one time described as being one of the most wealthy and powerful men in the United States, second only to President George Washington. He was known as the financier of the Revolution, Robert Morris was. But in 1796, the land bubble speculation burst. And Robert Morris here was very wealthy, but he had invested very heavily in land. He had signed the Declaration of Independence, and after that, the Articles of Confederation, and subsequently the U.S. Constitution. He was the first senator from Pennsylvania, and he invested his entire fortune in land in the mid 1790s and ended up bankrupt and in debtor's prison. In fact, the first bankruptcy act of the Federal Bankruptcy Act was actually passed to get Robert Morris out of prison because they felt sorry for him. You know, he'd done so much for the country, and he ended up in prison. And the massive fraud, and this is one of the most fascinating parts of this whole talk, was not totally evident until years later. In 1839, a special state finance commission investigating the matter received 2 reports from the Georgia Surveyor General. One noted that the actual number of acres in the state totaled 35.5 million acres, while the other reported that based on registered maps and records, the state's total acreage was 54.8 million acres. The discrepancy of more than 19 million acres was for the most part accounted for by fraudulent land grants in the 24 then existing headright counties. So, fascinating. Now, this is the ultimate violation of PowerPoint presentations. You never put something like this up. But I think it's important, and I want to show it to you, and I'll walk you through it. These are actual land areas of headright counties compared to areas granted in those counties. And I want to show you 3 of them. One is Franklin County. Remember, that was the first county? Franklin County, as of 1839, had 499,000 acres in it. But it had 5.1 million deeded acres, okay? This is Montgomery County. It had 407,000 actual acres. It had 7.4 million deeded acres. And Washington County, where I live, had at the time 416,000 acres, and it had 5 million deeded acres. So, in essence, the actual area of these counties was 8.7 million acres, and there were 29 million deeded acres when you start adding all of these up. It was incredible. It was incredible. And the vast majority of these, again, I tell you, were bought by speculators, people in quote unquote investing in land and so forth. In the mid-19th century, Robert Pell, who was a New York land speculator, bought 4 million acres in Georgia, much of it from the bankrupt firm that formerly belonged to Robert Morris. And this is a bulletin or a pamphlet that he prepared. I think it was in 1865, trying to sell this land. This actual thing is in this. This was taken, you can see, from the New York Public Library, but an actual copy of this is in the Hargrave Library. I believe it's Hargrave. Is that right? At University of Georgia. You can actually find a copy of this. And he's talking about this. It says, the object of this publication is to facilitate me in my efforts to use my large possessions of 4 million acres of yellow pine timberlands in Georgia to the best advantage. And he talks about where they are. He says, these lands are heavily timbered and lie in large bodies. The soil is fertile, the climate healthy, and they offer opportunities and facilities for the creation of wealth unsurpassed by any section of equal extent of the South Georgia. And he goes on, this booklet just praises his land. And if you were a speculator from, say, Virginia and New York, or I don't know if New Jersey existed then, but you would say, oh, this is great, I got to buy these. And the Washington County Courthouse was burned by Sherman when he came through in 1864. But I went over to the courthouse when I was researching this and looked in the deed books, and these are from 1869, I believe. I don't have the date right in front of me. These deeds record from the late 1860s in the Washington County Courthouse, where I live in Sandersville, document sales by Robert Pell or of some of Robert Morris's former holdings. For these 8 tracts alone, now the acreage is $412,000. These were the sales when they were originally bought by Robert Morris, 1793, 94, 95. These were the people that sold them. This is who had them. Okay. I'm sorry, he was the one that bought them. Forgive me. This is the one that Robert Morris. You see, all these are from Robert Morris. And you look, there were 412,000 acres on just 8 tracts, which were sold in Washington County in the late 1860s. And the whole county, as I tell you now, only has about 430. This is 8 tracts in the entire county. These were all bogus. Okay. Well into the early 20th century, land transactions based mainly on fraudulent deeds from the Pine Barrens Speculation era continued to be bought and sold. The Georgia Secretary of State got so many inquiries, they were prepared a form letter to be sent out in response saying, quote, hoping to protect innocent people from designing and unscrupulous land sharks who are offering them for sale all over the United States by showing the utter worthlessness of all such fraudulent grants, which are not worth the paper on which they are written. So a lot of people bought them and they lost their money. So those are the two things, and I hope it's not too complicated, and I hope you don't mind my reading it, but I think it makes it a lot clearer if I do that. So, yes, ma'am. Pardon? I'm sorry.
How did the state of Georgia fix?
They didn't. Most of the time people would show up with fraudulent deeds, and you had somebody who had probably settled there, and they had adverse possession of the land, if nothing else. I think if they took it to court, the settler would win. But the deeds were not, as the Secretary of State said, were probably not worth the paper on which they were printed, and it's reasonable to assume that the deed was fraudulent based on such evidence as that courthouse record there. Okay.
So there wasn't a whole lot of litigation over all that?
I don't think there was as litigious back then as we are now. Most of my daughters are attorneys, and they don't. But neither one of them are into suing anybody. They all do other things.
Did the settlers kind of know that this might be fraud?
No, they had no idea. Think of this. This was a vast wilderness. You had nothing but Indian trails that were basically how you got around. It was, there was no communication. There were no newspapers. There was no internet. Certainly no radio. They had no, and somebody sells them a piece of land, and this person lives in New York, or they live in New York and bought a piece of land. Well, it's a long ways from New York to here. And, someone would say, well, I put like Robert Morris, I put my fortune in land, and, he ended up in prison, but he was a high profile. The poor individual who puts, their savings in land, he would just simply be broke, I guess.
I always heard the expression Georgia crackers came from cracking the whip from the settlers who were in a hurry to get there. Mm-hmm. So I was wondering if, like you said, the settlers, 9/10 of the law is possession or what have you, so they were just kind of going out there to get it. And they had a legal claim for it.
They had a claim, but I don't think the claim would have been upheld because of the obvious malfeasance and illegality of everything. Yes, sir.
So the federal government bailed out on the Yazoo.
Mm-hmm.
What did the federal government do? They get the land?
They got the land, and subsequently it became Alabama and Mississippi. Yeah.
When were they made states?
I have to say I don't know. Yes, ma'am.
Why was it called the Yazoo?
Pardon?
Why was it called the Yazoo?
Because it was at the side of the Yazoo River, and I looked that up one time. I was told it meant death, but I don't think that's really true. It's apparently a local Indian name. Yes, sir.
The map that you had that was the big violation of PowerPoint had some acres were inflated, like the 3-4 example. Mm-hmm. Some were not as great, right? Some were.
No, the numbers I gave were an aggregate of the four. The last case, for example, of the 4 companies that bought it. This was the aggregate amount of land that would have been sold either the first or second go around of the Yazoo Fraud.
So, your opinion, was the misrepresentation of the number of acres truly fraud, or was it miscalculation?
Well, the whole thing was crooked. Everybody was bribed, and I don't know the details to that. I'm sure that perhaps they're available somewhere. But these people said, we want to buy 10,000 acres, and when in fact it was probably 100,000 acres. I don't think anybody went out there and surveyed the property. I think they may have gotten a map and looked at it. I'm pretty confident that's the case, although I don't have any documentation for it. Yes, ma'am. Um, I imagine it. I imagine there have been other similar things that happened, but the answer is I don't know. But if anybody, this was early in the republic, and I think if they had any sense, they would have looked at the experience here and not and tried to avoid the same thing happening a second, or third, or fourth, or 10th time. Land speculation has always been very popular. Land speculation has frequently been associated with misrepresentation, if I can use that word. And you know, how many of you get phone calls wanting to buy something every day? But one, yeah, not a day goes by when I don't get a phone call, or a week, not a week goes by when I don't get a phone call from someone with a. I always ask where you call. The last one that called yesterday was calling from the Philippines. She said, and most of the time they don't admit. I'm calling from California. I said, really? What's it's California now? What's the cap? The capital of? I don't know. And they come from spoofed numbers from small South Georgia town. I am calling from California, and instead you got the area code is some town in South Georgia. It's terrible. It's terrible. Good. Well, thank you so much. Oh, one last thing. I have a few books. I only brought